That's it.
Arthur
Keep your bow
Sterling
straight.
sat in the back
Like
seat
this?
of his sleek
Yes,
black sedan,
perfect. Just like that.
watching the city blocks pass by with a look of utter
All
disinterest.
right, remember to relax your
He
shoulders.
adjusted his cufflinks, the silver glinting under the streetlights, and let out a long, weary
Ready to try?
sigh.
Pick up the bow.
Okay.
Outside, the world
Good.
was
Now
moving
hold it
fast.
gently.
People rushing
like
to
that.
jobs, to homes, to families.
Relax your elbow.
But Arthur
Let
felt
the bow
entirely
flow.
removed
Like
from it
this?
all.
Yes, perfect. You're
He
a
was a
natural.
man who had
Thank
everything,
you.
yet
Don't
at
be
this moment,
nervous,
he
just
felt
like
he
we
had
practiced.
nothing but a headache. His assistant,
That's
a
it.
young man
Beautiful.
named David, sat beside
That was
him,
wonderful.
tapping
You have real
nervously on a
talent.
tablet.
Thank you. Can I try again?
Of
Sir,
course.
we are almost
Show
there,
them.
David
Beautiful.
said, his voice
Here you
tight.
go. Hold it
The
gently.
Sunnydale
Okay,
Community
like
Home,
this?
the
Perfect.
director
Now
is
try a
expecting
long,
us.
smooth
Remember,
stroke.
this is just a quick walkthrough.
Okay, now
A
draw
few
the bow
photos,
smoothly.
a handshake, and
Like
we
this?
leave. The
Yes,
press is
perfect.
already
Keep going.
waiting outside. Arthur didn't look up. I know the drill, David. Smile, look generous, and get back to making money. I don't see why I have to waste a Tuesday afternoon for this. It helps with the merger, sir. The public likes a billionaire with a heart, David replied, though he flinched as if expecting Arthur to snap at him. Arthur just grunted. A heart. That was something he wasn't sure he possessed anymore. At 50 years old, Arthur had built an empire that touched the skies. He had towers named after him, jets at his disposal, and bank accounts that could buy small countries. But the cost of all that was a quiet house on a hill and a solitude that had slowly turned into a thick, suffocating wall. The car glided to a stop. There was no dramatic weather outside. It was a dry, sunny afternoon, the kind where the sun beats down on the pavement and creates a shimmering heat haze over the asphalt. Arthur stepped out, the heat immediately pressing against his expensive suit. He smoothed his jacket and looked at the building in front of him. Sunnydale Community Home was an old structure, made of faded red brick and tall windows. It wasn't crumbling, but it certainly wasn't modern. The glass on the front doors was reinforced with wire mesh, and the paint on the window frames was peeling slightly. To Arthur, it looked inefficient. It looked like a place where dreams went to gather dust. A small crowd of reporters was gathered near the entrance, held back by a velvet rope. Cameras flashed the moment Arthur's shoe hit the pavement. He put on his best smile, the practiced, charming one that showed teeth but never reached his eyes. He waved, a smooth, practiced motion. "Mr. Sterling, over here," a reporter shouted. "Just a quick visit, folks," Arthur said, his voice deep and confident. "Just checking in on the community." He walked past the cameras, ignoring the shouted questions about his latest stock options. He pushed through the front glass doors, which swung open easily with a hydraulic hiss. The noise of the city was cut off instantly, replaced by the smell of floor wax and cooked vegetables. It was the smell of a large institution, clean but impersonal. A woman in a beige cardigan hurried forward, her hands clasped together. She looked anxious, her eyes darting between Arthur and the photographers peering through the glass. "Mr. Sterling, welcome, welcome," she stammered, offering a hand that was slightly damp. "I am Ms. Gable, the director. We are so honored to have you." Arthur shook her hand briefly, his grip firm and dry. "Thank you, Ms. Gable. I'm sure you are. Shall we get this over with, Ms.?" Gable's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly. "Of course, right this way. The children have just finished their lunch." They walked down a long corridor lined with linoleum tiles that squeaked under Arthur's polished shoes. The walls were covered in crayon drawings, stick figures of families, houses with smoking chimneys and bright yellow suns. Arthur barely glanced at them. To him, it was just decoration. It didn't mean anything. "Here is the cafeteria," Ms. Gable said, gesturing to a large room filled with long plastic tables. A few staff members were wiping down surfaces. "We managed to feed over 100 children a day thanks to donations." Arthur nodded, looking at his watch. "Efficient, good." They moved on. They passed a small library with dusty books and a computer room with machines that looked like they belonged in a museum. Arthur felt a pang of impatience. He hated seeing things that weren't top of the line. It offended his business sensibilities. He wanted to offer to buy them new computers just so he wouldn't have to look at the old ones, but he stayed silent. "And here, Ms. Gable said, stopping at a pair of open double doors that led to the recreation room, "is where the children spend most of their free time." Arthur stepped inside. The room was large, with a high ceiling and scuffed hardwood floors. It was currently empty, save for a few stragglers. Most of the children had gone outside to the playground, visible through the large windows on the far wall. Their laughter was muffled by the glass, a distant, happy sound that felt alien to Arthur. He looked around. There were shelves of board games with missing pieces, a few broken toys, and a television set that was turned off. It was a sad room. It felt forgotten. He turned to Ms. Gable, his patience wearing thin. "Well, Ms. Gable, I've seen enough," Arthur said, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. "My foundation will send a check. You need new computers. I'll have my assistant arrange it." He was already turning to leave, his mind shifting back to a conference call he had scheduled for 4:00 p.m. He had done his duty. He had shown his face. He could leave now and go back to his world of glass and steel. "Just a moment, sir," Ms. Gable said, her voice a little more urgent. There is one girl who didn't go outside. She often stays behind. She's quite unique. If you have a moment—" Arthur stopped. He checked his watch again. He had 10 minutes before he really needed to leave. He sighed, rolling his shoulders back. "Unique? How?" "She doesn't play with the others much," Ms. Gable said, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "She keeps to herself. She has a talent. But she is shy. I just thought you might like to see that we aren't just about housing them. We try to nurture them, too, even with limited means." Arthur followed the director's gaze toward the far corner of the recreation room. It was a shadowy spot, away from the bright windows where the other children played in the sun. Arthur squinted. He hadn't noticed her before because she was so still. Sitting on a small, plastic chair in the corner was a girl. She looked to be about 8 or 9 years old. She was wearing a simple blue dress that looked a size too big, and her dark hair was tied back in a ponytail that was coming loose. Her knees were pulled up to her chest, and her arms were wrapped around them. But it wasn't her posture that caught Arthur's attention. It was the object resting against the wall next to her. It was a violin case. It looked terrible. The black fabric was torn in places, revealing the gray cardboard underneath. Duct tape held one of the latches in place. It was battered, beaten, and looked like it should have been thrown in the trash years ago. Arthur let out a short, dry chuckle. The sound was sharp and cruel in the quiet room. He walked over to the girl, his footsteps heavy on the floor. Ms. Gable followed a few steps behind, looking nervous. Arthur stood over the girl. He looked down at her with a mixture of amusement and pity. He saw her shoes, worn at the soles. He saw the frayed cuffs of her dress. He saw the sad excuse for a musical instrument case. The girl looked up. Her eyes were large and dark. She didn't look afraid, which surprised him. Most people were intimidated by his presence. She just looked, waiting. "Ms. Gable tells me you have a talent," Arthur said, his voice condescending. He didn't try to hide his smirk. He gestured to the case. "Is that supposed to be a violin?" "My gardener has better tools than that." The girl didn't speak. She simply watched him. Arthur felt a strange need to provoke a reaction. He was used to people scrambling to impress him. This girl's silence was unnerving. He looked at the dilapidated case and then back at his own expensive watch. "You know," Arthur said, leaning down slightly, his voice loud enough for Ms. Gable to hear clearly. "I've bought violins that cost more than this entire building. I have a Stradivarius sitting in a glass case at home that nobody touches. It's a decoration. Because real music takes soul, and most people just make noise." He laughed again, a hollow sound. He was mocking her, mocking the idea that this little orphan with a taped-up case could produce anything of value. He looked at the girl, expecting her to look down, to blush, to run away. That was usually how these things went. The weak retreated from the strong. "Go on then," Arthur said, waving his hand dismissively. "Play something. Let's see if you can actually make a sound other than a screech. I bet you can't play a single note." The girl blinked once. She slowly uncurled her legs and stood up. She was small for her age. She reached for the case. Arthur watched, his arms crossed over his chest, ready to turn away the second the squeaking started. He had already written her off. He had already judged her as another charity case who would never amount to anything. He didn't expect the look of determination that crossed her small face. He didn't expect the way she handled the case, not as something broken, but as something precious. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air between them. "Play the violin," Arthur scoffed one last time, his ego swelling. "And maybe I'll adopt you." He laughed at his own joke. It was a cruel, impossible offer. He had no intention of adopting anyone. It was just a way to highlight how ridiculous the situation was. But as the girl clicked open the latches of the old case, Arthur felt a sudden shift in the air. The arrogance was still there, but underneath it, for a brief second, was a curiosity he hadn't felt in years. He stood in the center of the room, a giant among toys, waiting to be proven right. Completely unaware that he was about to be proven wrong in the most devastating way possible. The silence that followed Arthur's statement was heavy. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but the kind that presses against your ears, waiting for something to snap. Arthur stood with his arms crossed, his expensive suit jacket pulling slightly at his shoulders. He looked down at the girl, his chin tilted up in that way he always looked at people he considered beneath him. He had thrown out the challenge like a bone to a stray dog, expecting her to ignore it or perhaps cry. To him, this was just a momentary distraction, a cruel game to pass the time before he got back into his air-conditioned car. Ms. Gable, the director, took a sharp breath. She stepped forward, her hands wringing together in front of her beige cardigan. "Mr. Sterling, please," she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "She is just a child. She doesn't understand your jokes. Lily doesn't speak much, and I don't want you upsetting her." Arthur didn't look at the woman. He kept his eyes locked on the small girl in the oversized dress. "I'm not upset, Ms. Gable. I'm making a business proposition. A simple trade, talent for a home. Isn't that what you do here? Prepare them for the real world?" His voice was smooth, like velvet over a rock. It was the voice he used in boardrooms to intimidate rivals, deep and utterly cold. "In the real world, you get nothing for free. If she wants a life, she has to show me she deserves it." He looked at the girl, whose name was apparently Lily. She hadn't moved. She stood there by the plastic chair, her small hand resting on the taped handle of the violin case. She looked so small in the big, echoing room. The sunlight coming through the high windows made the dust motes dance around her head like a halo, but Arthur didn't see a halo. He saw a scruffy kid with a broken instrument. "Well?" Arthur asked, raising an eyebrow. He checked his watch again, a deliberate movement to show them how valuable his time was. "Tick-tock, I don't have all day for silence. If you can't play, just say so. I'll write the check for the new computers and I'll be on my way. No harm done." He was mocking her. He wanted her to refuse. He wanted to be right about the world, that people were all show and no substance. He wanted to walk out of here feeling justified in his superiority. But then, the girl moved. It wasn't a frantic movement. She didn't rush. She reached down and clicked the latches on the old case. They made a dull, metallic snapping sound. "Ms. Gable took a step back, covering her mouth with her hand, as if she was afraid of what was about to happen. She looked like she wanted to grab the girl and run, but she was paralyzed by the presence of the billionaire. Lily opened the lid. The inside of the case was lined with faded blue velvet that was wearing thin in spots. The violin inside was old, much older than the case. It wasn't a shiny, new instrument. The wood was a dark, reddish-brown, polished by hands over many years, but it had scratches and dings that told stories of being bumped and scraped. Arthur watched, his face impassive. He had seen violins worth millions. He knew what good wood looked like, and this, to him, looked like firewood. He let out a soft scoff, a breath of air through his nose. "Careful," he sneered. "Don't get a splinter." Lily ignored him. She gently lifted the instrument out. She handled it with a care that surprised Arthur. Her fingers, small and thin, curled around the neck of the violin with a familiarity that spoke of years of practice. She checked the bridge, plucked one string softly with her thumb, and listened to the note. It was a quiet sound, a hollow ding that hung in the air for a second. She reached back into the case and pulled out the bow. The horsehair on the bow was fraying slightly at the edges, and the stick was warped just a little bit. It was a tool that should have been retired years ago. Arthur knew a professional musician would have thrown it in the trash without a second thought. "You're really going to do this?" Arthur asked, his voice dripping with amusement. "You're going to play that thing for me, for a billionaire? You think that toy is going to impress me?" Lily finally looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and clear. They didn't hold the fear he was used to seeing in people. They didn't hold the greed he saw in his business partners. They just held a strange, quiet calm. She didn't say a word. She didn't defend her instrument. She didn't make excuses for its condition. She tucked the violin under her chin. It looked too big for her small frame, like she was being swallowed by the instrument. She raised the bow, her elbow high, her wrist relaxed. Arthur shifted his weight, ready to wince. He expected the screeching sound of a beginner. He expected the discordant, painful noise of rosin flying and strings vibrating wrongly. He braced himself for the embarrassment he was about to witness, the tragic failure of a child trying to be something she wasn't. He was ready to laugh again, to turn to Miss Gable and say, "See. Hope is useless," Miss Gable whispered from the side. "She practices every day, in the storage closet. She found this in the donation bin 3 years ago." "She taught herself?" Arthur rolled his eyes. "Taught herself," he muttered. "That's even worse. You can't teach yourself talent. You're born with it or you buy it." And she certainly didn't buy it. He stared at the girl, waiting for the failure to begin. He wanted the failure. He needed the failure to confirm his worldview. If this girl could just make a fool of herself, he could leave, donate the money, and go back to his life feeling like he had won. He was the predator in the room, and she was the prey. It was just the natural order of things. The recreation room was silent except for the distant hum of the air conditioning and the muffled laughter of children outside on the playground. The contrast between the bright, happy world outside and the tense, quiet standoff inside the room was stark. Lily took a deep breath. Her chest rose and fell under the blue fabric of her dress. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were focused on something far away, something Arthur couldn't see. She brought the bow down on the strings, but she didn't start fast. She started slow. She pulled the bow across the lowest string, a long, dragging motion that produced a sound that Arthur was not expecting. It wasn't a screech. It was a low, rumbling hum. It was rich and warm, vibrating deep in his chest before he could even process it with his ears. The sound filled the corner of the room, swelling up like water filling a jar. Arthur's smirk twitched. He had been ready to turn his head away, but the sound caught his attention like a hook. It was a clean sound, surprisingly clean. He looked at the bow, expecting it to be some kind of trick, but she was just moving it back and forth with a steady, practiced hand. "Ms." Gable let out a breath she had been holding, her hand dropping from her mouth to her chest. Lily didn't stop. She drew the bow across the next string, then the next. She wasn't playing a melody yet. She was just pulling the sound out of the wood, waking the instrument up. It sounded like a voice, a deep, mournful voice waking from a long sleep. Arthur watched her fingers. They weren't fumbling. They were pressing down on the strings with precision. The notes changed pitch smoothly, sliding into each other. It was the sound of a conversation, not a lesson. He felt a strange sensation in his throat. It was annoyance. Yes, annoyance. He was annoyed that she wasn't terrible. He was annoyed that his joke was backfiring. He had wanted to be the winner of this interaction, but suddenly, the power dynamic was shifting. The girl in the dirty dress with the broken violin wasn't cowering. She was standing tall, lost in the world she was creating with her instrument. Arthur cleared his throat, trying to break the spell. He wanted to interrupt, to tell her to stop, but he found that he couldn't. The sound had wrapped around him. It was a simple melody, haunting and slow. It wasn't a pop song or a nursery rhyme. It was something older, something that sounded like it had been written in a time when people had less but felt more. The girl swayed slightly, moving with the music. She was no longer in the recreation room of an orphanage. She was somewhere else. And for a terrifying moment, Arthur felt like he was being pulled there with her. He stayed rooted to the floor, his arms still crossed, but his hands had clenched into fists inside his elbows. He refused to show it, refused to admit that the little girl had his attention. She was playing, and she was playing well, better than well. She was playing with a truth that Arthur hadn't heard in years, and it was making him uncomfortable in a way he hadn't felt in decades. He had asked for a joke, but he was getting a revelation, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. The sound that came from the old violin was not what Arthur had expected. It was not the thin, scratching noise of a beginner. It was a deep, rich tone that seemed to vibrate in the air around them. It was heavy, like a blanket being pulled tight. The melody started slowly. It was sad. It was the kind of sad that sits in your stomach and doesn't let go. Arthur stood frozen. His arms were still crossed over his chest, but his fingers, which had been tapping impatiently against his expensive suit sleeve, stopped moving. He stared at the girl. Lily had her eyes closed. She wasn't looking at her fingers. She wasn't looking at the strings. She was feeling the music. Her small face was calm, her eyebrows pulled together slightly in concentration, but there was a softness there too. The recreation room, which had felt so large and empty just moments ago, suddenly felt very small. The music filled every corner. It bounced off the linoleum floor and the painted brick walls. It drowned out the hum of the fluorescent lights. It drowned out the distant sound of the children playing outside. It seemed to drown out Arthur's own thoughts. He tried to hold on to his arrogance. He tried to keep that sneer on his face. He told himself it was a trick, a coincidence. She just got lucky with that first note, he thought. Wait until she tries to change keys. Wait until she speeds up. She will mess up. They always mess up. But Lily didn't mess up. Her bow arm moved with a steady, fluid rhythm. She drew the sound out of the instrument like she was pulling water from a deep well. It was effortless. The violin sang. It cried. It was a melody Arthur didn't recognize, but it felt familiar. It felt like something he had heard a long time ago, in a dream maybe, or in a life he had forgotten. Ms. Gable, the director, stood by the wall. She had stopped wringing her hands. She was watching Arthur, not the girl. She saw the change in his posture. She saw the way his shoulders, usually so stiff and square, had dropped an inch. The tension was leaving his body, being replaced by something else. Shock. Arthur watched Lily's left hand. Her fingers were dancing on the neck of the violin. They were small, but they moved with the precision of a surgeon or a master craftsman. She played a run of notes, a cascade of sound that tumbled down like water over rocks. It was fast, but it wasn't rushed. Every note was clean, every note was perfect. How, Arthur thought. How does a girl with no money, no teacher, and a broken instrument play like this? He had been to the best concert halls in the world. He had sat in the front row of the Sydney Opera House. He had watched the greatest virtuosos of the century play Stradivarius violins worth more than entire neighborhoods. They had skill, they had technique, they had precision, but this was different. This had pain in it. As the melody grew, shifting from a low murmur to a soaring cry, Arthur felt a tightness in his chest. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in years. It was a pressure right behind his ribs. The music was telling a story. It wasn't a happy story. It was a story about being alone. It was a story about standing in a room full of people and feeling like a ghost. It was a story about wanting something so badly that it hurt to breathe. Arthur knew that story. The music swelled. Lily leaned into the instrument, putting her whole weight into the sound. The bow moved faster, the notes coming quicker now, a storm of emotion. It was frantic, desperate, and beautiful all at once. The sound seemed to cut through the air and go straight into Arthur's veins. Suddenly, he wasn't in the recreation room anymore. The smell of floor wax faded. The bright lights dimmed in his mind. He was transported back. He was 20 years old again. He was standing in a small, cramped apartment that smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap coffee. He was looking at his mother. She was sitting in a worn-out armchair, looking tired, her hands rough from years of cleaning houses to support him. He remembered the look in her eyes. It was a look of sacrifice. She had given everything for him. She had worked herself to the bone so he could have a chance. And what had he done? He had left. As soon as he had the money, he had left. He had bought the big house, the cars, the suits. He had surrounded himself with luxury. But he had forgotten where he came from. He had forgotten the sacrifice. The violin let out a high, piercing note that hung in the air like a question. It sounded like a voice asking, was it worth it? Arthur's breath hitched in his throat. He felt a prickling sensation behind his eyes. No asterisk, he thought, panic rising in his chest. Not here, not in front of them. I am Arthur Sterling. I do not cry. I am strong. I am successful. He gritted his teeth. He tried to build the wall back up. He tried to think about stock prices, about the merger, about the numbers on the spreadsheet. But the music was too loud. It crashed over his defenses like a wave over a sandcastle. It didn't care about his money. It didn't care about his status. It stripped him bare. Lily played a series of chords now, double stops that made the instrument sound like two people talking. It was the sound of a conversation that never happened. It was the words, I love you, that were never spoken. It was the goodbye that was never said. Arthur remembered his mother's funeral. It had been 5 years ago. It had been a rainy day. He stopped that thought. No rain. It had been a gray, windy afternoon. The cemetery was cold. He had stood by the grave, surrounded by people in black suits, and he hadn't shed a tear. He had stood like a statue, cold and hard. He had told himself he was too busy to grieve. He had a company to run. He had deals to close. He had pushed the sadness down so deep that he thought it was gone forever. But this little girl with her battered violin was digging it up. She was pulling it out into the light. He looked at Lily again. She was so small. The instrument looked huge against her chest, but she commanded it. She wasn't playing for applause. She wasn't playing for a grade. She was playing because it was the only way she could speak. The music was her voice, and for the first time, Arthur was listening. His heart was pounding against his ribs. The wall he had built around himself, the wall of money and arrogance and indifference, was cracking. It was splitting down the middle. He felt exposed. He felt terrified. He felt like a little boy again, lost in a big world just wanting to go home. The melody slowed down again. It returned to the soft, sad tune from the beginning. It was a whisper now. It was the sound of acceptance. It was the sound of loneliness settling in for the night. Arthur's hands uncrossed. They fell to his sides, limp and heavy. His fingers trembled slightly. He looked down at his expensive leather shoes. He saw a drop of water hit the polished leather, then another. He touched his cheek. It was wet. He was crying. He hadn't even realized it was happening. The tears were silent, sliding down his face, hot against his cold skin. He couldn't stop them. The music had found the one thing he had protected all his life, his heart, and it had broken it wide open. Ms. Gable took a step forward, a tissue in her hand, but Arthur didn't see her. He only saw the girl. He only heard the song. The arrogance was gone. The mockery was gone. There was only the raw, aching truth of the music. He felt weak. He felt silly, but mostly he felt human. For the first time in decades, Arthur Sterling felt human. And it hurt. It hurt terribly. But it was the most beautiful hurt he had ever felt. The room was utterly still. The dust motes danced in the light. The violin hummed its last, low notes. And Arthur stood there, a billionaire brought to his knees by a song. The music stopped. The last note, a soft, trembling whisper, faded into the stale air of the recreation room. For a moment there was absolute silence. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like a blanket settling over the room. The air felt different now. The tension that had been there before, the arrogance, the mockery, had vanished completely, replaced by something raw and fragile. Arthur Sterling stood rooted to the spot. His chest heaved slightly, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. He could feel the wet tracks of tears cooling on his cheeks. He didn't move to wipe them away. It was as if his body had forgotten how to function. The great Arthur Sterling, the man who could fire 100 people without blinking, the man who negotiated million-dollar deals before breakfast, was paralyzed. He looked at the girl. Lily stood with her arms dropping to her sides, the violin held loosely in one hand, the bow in the other. She looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from pouring your entire soul into something. But her eyes were clear. They watched him. There was no triumph in them, no gloating. There was just a quiet patience. Ms. Gable, the director, stood by the wall. She was holding her breath, her hands clasped tight against her chest. She looked from the girl to the billionaire, her eyes wide with shock. She had known Lily had talent, but she had never seen the girl play like that. And she had certainly never seen a man like Arthur Sterling look so broken. Arthur's hands trembled at his sides. He felt a deep, burning shame. It wasn't the shame of losing a deal. It was the shame of being wrong. It was the shame of cruelty. He remembered his laugh, that sharp, barking sound he had made just minutes ago. "Play the violin and I'll adopt you." It had been a joke, a cruel, arrogant joke. He had treated this moment, this girl, her life, like it was a game. He looked at the battered instrument in her hand. The duct tape, the scratches, the chipped wood. He had judged it. He had judged her. He had looked at the surface and seen garbage. He hadn't looked inside. He hadn't seen the gold hidden within the cracks. Arthur started to speak, but his voice cracked. It sounded like gravel in his throat. He coughed, trying to clear the lump that was lodged there. He felt incredibly small. The room seemed to spin around him. He needed to sit down. He needed to feel something solid. He took a step back, stumbling slightly, and his leg hit the small, plastic chair Lily had been sitting on earlier. He didn't care about his suit. He didn't care about his dignity. He sank down onto the small, blue plastic chair. It creaked under his weight, too small for a grown man, but he didn't notice. He buried his face in his hands. The sobs came then. They weren't quiet, polite tears. They were deep, racking sobs that shook his shoulders. He gasped for air, the sound ugly and raw in the quiet room. He was mourning. He was mourning the years he had spent building walls instead of bridges. He was mourning the loneliness he had wrapped around himself like a shield. The music had pierced that shield, and now all the pain he had locked away was pouring out. Miss Gable took a hesitant step forward. "Mr. Sterling, are you all right?" "Should I call someone?" Arthur shook his head violently, his face still in his hands. "No," he choked out. "Don't call anyone. I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. He was far from fine. He was falling apart, and he couldn't stop it. Lily walked forward. She moved softly, her worn shoes making no sound on the floor. She stopped right in front of him. She didn't say anything. She didn't try to comfort him with words. She just stood there, a small presence in a world that had just gotten too big. After a long minute, Arthur looked up. His eyes were red and swollen. His nose was running. He looked a mess. He looked at the girl, really looked at her for the first time, not as a charity case, not as a prop for a photo, but as a human being. "How," Arthur whispered, his voice was barely audible. "How did you learn to play like that with that?" He pointed a shaking finger at the violin. Lily looked down at the instrument. She stroked the wood gently. "It belonged to my mom," she said softly. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Before she got sick. She taught me that music isn't about the instrument. It's about what's inside you," she said. "She said if you play what you feel, people will hear you." Arthur closed his eyes as a fresh wave of tears spilled over. Play what you feel. He had spent his whole life playing what people wanted to hear. He said the right things, wore the right suits, bought the right cars. He had buried his feelings so deep he didn't even know what they were anymore. But this girl, this orphan with nothing, had found a way to speak the truth. "I am sorry," Arthur said. The words felt clumsy on his tongue. He wasn't used to apologizing, he was used to being right. "I am so sorry for what I said earlier. I was wrong, I was a fool." He looked around the empty room. He thought of his mansion, the huge, echoing hallways, the silent dining room where he ate alone every night. He had everything money could buy, and he had nothing. He was the poorest man in the room. "You asked me something," Arthur said, his voice gaining a little strength, though it still wavered. "Or rather, I made a promise, a joke." He looked Lily in the eye. He saw a flash of understanding there. She knew what he was talking about. "I said I would adopt you if you played," Arthur said. He swallowed hard. "I wasn't serious, I was being cruel, but now—" He paused, taking a deep, shaky breath. "Now I don't think I can walk out of here without you." He didn't mean it as a transaction anymore. He didn't mean it as a purchase. He meant it as a lifeline. He needed her. He needed that music. He needed the truth she carried inside her. He needed to be reminded that there was still something real in the world. "I can't give you a mother," Arthur said, his voice trembling. "And I can't replace your family, but I have a house, a very big, very empty house. It has a room with good light for practicing, and I promise I will listen." He looked at the violin. "And I will buy you a new one, the best one." "No, wait." He stopped himself. He looked at the battered wood in her hands. "We will fix this one first. This one is special." Lily looked at him. She studied his face, the tear streaks, the red eyes, the messy hair. She saw the cracks in his armor. She saw the lonely man underneath the billionaire suit. "I don't need a new violin," she said quietly, "but I would like a home." Arthur let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. He took her small hand in his large, warm one. He squeezed it gently. "Then you have one," he said. "If you'll have me." The words hung in the air. It wasn't a command. It was a question, a plea from one lonely soul to another. Miss Gable wiped a tear from her own eye. She stayed silent, letting the moment breathe. Outside the windows, the sun was getting lower in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the floor. The dust motes danced in the light, no longer looking like dirt, but like tiny particles of magic. Arthur Sterling had walked into this building as a king, expecting to give charity. He was leaving as a man, having received a gift he could never repay. The music had stopped, but the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of hope. It was full of a beginning. He looked at Lily, and for the first time in years, Arthur didn't feel the crushing weight of his money. He felt the lightness of a heart that was finally waking up. He squeezed the little girl's hand again, tighter this time, afraid she might vanish like the notes of her song. But she was solid, she was real, and she was going home.